The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. We had a very dense discussion this morning with a multitude of subjects, so I will choose a few and report on those. Indeed, we started the day with a very good discussion about Europe's economic competitiveness. And here I would report on 4 different strands. First, that it is so important to continue to build on our strength, and we have many strengths. In other words, we have to focus on the areas where we already have a competitive edge or where we could take the lead. And for this, our industrial and our energy policies are putting us on the right path. You're familiar with the elements, for example, the Net Zero Industry Act or the Critical Raw Materials Act, but also now the reform of the electricity market is important to drive the production of renewables up and thus the energy prices down. And I very much welcome the agreement that we have found this week in Council, so now we can proceed with that reform. And there is the platform that we call STEP for strategic investments, part of our proposed revised EU budget. STEP is the fund that we want to create to step up investments in emerging and strategic technologies. And I hope that all these proposals will be adopted soon so that we can kind of start our economic future right now. My second point is different. It's of course, as technologies are important, as important are the people to work with these technologies. And this is something we have also discussed on Wednesday afternoon with the tripartite summit. What we need to do is, because it's developing more and more into a bottleneck for our economy, is to look at the labor market and the lack of skilled labor or even labor. So the shortages have to be addressed, and we discussed that we have to tap into the existing potential and improve the situation. We have a record low unemployment rate of 6%, but if you look in the different elements of the labor market, we see that we have a much higher youth unemployment, so first task to address. Then we see that the female participation is way lower, than 12 percentage points lower than the male participation in the workforce. So here we have to engage in the important topic of creating the infrastructure to reconcile work and family, like kindergarten and good schools, but also, of course, have reconciliation of work and family in the companies. The third element where there's a lot of untapped potential are the older workers. And the fourth we discussed is legal migration. We had last year 3.7 million legal migrants coming to our labor market, and this is very good, and we need more of this. The discussion we have in migration is on the 300 or 400,000 irregular migrants, and I will report later on this one. But the legal migration is important for our country, and we will need more of this. Finally, my third point for the topic of competitiveness, of course we have to do our homework in the European Union itself, but we also have to make sure that we have a level playing field globally for our companies. And we have, in this context, discussed the Inflation Reduction Act again. The immediate macroeconomic impact at the moment is minor, but if you look at the sectorial implications, they are measurable. So we need to stay very vigilant, especially when we come now into the phase where we do have for the European Green Deal the whole legislative framework in place, but now it goes into implementation. And the path to implementation is via guidelines. We have to shape the guidelines now. And to make sure that the clean tech industries have a competitive advantage in the European Union, it is important that we listen now to them, what is for them crucial when we implement the legislation. These are the so-called clean tech dialogues that we have with our industry. So we go sector by sector by sector to identify where we can support our industry. This big work and more about it should not distract us from the much greater impact of unfair practices that we see by China, also a part of the discussion. And I want to conclude with the fact that, yes, we need a strong economic base to build our future competitiveness. It's a challenge. But what we also need are fiscal rules that can match that challenge, because sound public finances open the space for more investment. And we should press ahead with the adoption now of our proposed new rules for the European economic governance. Here, I welcome that the Spanish presidency is working intensively and tirelessly on this matter. Indeed, at the end of this discussion, we took the opportunity to congratulate Greece for the extraordinary progress it has made over the past years. Regaining investment grade is a significant milestone. And we pay tribute to the Greek people who have made enormous sacrifices, but have every reason to feel good. They have been incredibly resilient. Still a lot remains to be done, but I'm confident that Greece will continue on the path of sustainable and inclusive growth. Now, let me turn to Ukraine. It was very clear in the debate. Despite the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, our focus continues to be on supporting Ukraine. And this is why I very much welcome that you invited yesterday President Zelensky to speak to us via VTC. We will continue delivering the much-needed weapons and ammunition. We will continue providing the much-needed financial relief. Just to a figure, altogether, if you look at Team Europe, we have provided almost 83 billion euros of assistance to Ukraine. Now, looking forward, the next step is the adoption of the 50 billion euro Ukraine facility, because Ukraine needs reliable and predictable financial support. Of course, we will continue also to support Ukraine as it walks the path leading to accession. We will provide our assessment, as you know, on such progress at the beginning of November. A final word on sanctions. We are in the process of preparing the 12th package of sanctions. Now we are in the consultations with the member states. In particular, we are looking into how to cut the remaining revenues Russia draws from the export of diamonds to Europe and its partners. This would be done in very close cooperation with our G7 partners, and we continue to make sure that our existing sanctions are properly implemented and effectively enforced. A last point on the immobilized assets of Russia in the European Union. This was also a point of discussion. We all recall that it was in March last year that we took collectively the important political decision to immobilize Russian sovereign assets. The value of these sovereign assets stands at 211 billion euro. And politically, we agreed that ultimately Russia must pay for the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine. We had a recent discussion of finance ministers in Marrakesh that allowed good progress on the basic principles. So the next step would be then an actual proposal. We're currently working on a proposal to initially focus on the so-called windfall profits. In other words, we will present a proposal to find a way how to use the proceeds from those assets that are currently benefiting a limited number of financial institutions in the European Union. These windfall profits are already quite substantial, and the idea is to pool them and then to channel them through the EU budget en bloc to Ukraine and the reconstruction of Ukraine. On migration, there was a strong support for the letter I sent to the leaders, and I will not reflect on the details of the letters, but the main message is that we're making good progress on the two-track approach. You know, on the one hand, it's the legislative track. Here, the discussions on the different pieces of legislation under the Migration and Asylum Pact are advancing well. I would like to thank the Council and the Parliament for this and for all their efforts. And now we must keep up the momentum, because we have to adopt this pact. The other track is the operational work. We are making good progress on the implementation of the 15 priority actions that we discussed in January. We have taken action to address the immediate situation along the different migratory routes that we have. And we have worked on advancing our cooperation with partner countries. And this is the principle also in moving forward now. So we will focus, first of all, on preventing irregular departures. For this, we have to increase the capacity of the neighboring countries for border surveillance and search and rescue. Then we need more outreach to countries of origin and transit. For this purpose, we need to build much more comprehensive and mutual beneficial partnership agreements, as we have discussed, for example, yesterday with Egypt. Then there is the important topic that we have to crack down on the smugglers and traffickers. In this context, we will present legislative proposals to fight smugglers and traffickers by the end of November. The legislation that we have in place is 20 years old, so it's high time to update it. And we will reinforce our cooperation with the UN agency, mostly UNODC. On top, we will soon host an international conference to launch a global alliance with a call to action against smugglers. To whomever you speak, whether it's country of origin or country of transit or a country where the debate of migration is intense, all understand and want to crack down on the cynical business of smugglers and traffickers. This is organized crime, and we have to fight it like we fight organized crime. Finally, on returns, as you know, the return rate this year so far has been 22%. Of those who have a return decision, this amount has to increase. Therefore, we offer to member states much more closer cooperation as Team Europe to speed up the procedures, to ensure the mutual recognition of return decisions. You have the decision in one member state, it's valid for all 27 member states, and most importantly, to organize joint return operations. Now, the better we are in the part that I mentioned at the very beginning, the legal migration, the legal pathways, the investment in education, the more we can be strict in the part of irregular migration. And this was finally the conclusion also of the debate on migration, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, President. We will open the floor to questions. So we start with the lady in white. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lyubov Pronina, Bloomberg News. I have a question for Madam President. The Commission requested additional funds from member states, but is there also understanding where the cuts will come from? Has the Commission maybe a clear list, a clear understanding? And if so, why wasn't it shared by member states ahead of this meeting? Thank you very much.
Yeah, the process is as follows. There is the initial proposal of the Commission. This has been done months ago. Then the proposal goes into, let's say, the working structures. And here the Spanish presidency has done a great job in producing now 3 different negotiation boxes. These negotiation boxes comprise the different views of the different 27 member states. So you see a maturing process in these negotiation boxes. It was and is important that in between there is a tour de table to have the leaders' views, in general, the political views. So yesterday the debate was not on figures, but it was on the general political view. And here you see, of course, that there are different views on, not on the priorities, they were broadly accepted.
Listening there to Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, making some live comments there in Brussels following a 2-day summit of EU leaders. Before that, we heard from Charles Michel, President of the European Council, and also before that, the French President Emmanuel Macron speaking, giving his comments following this summit. A lot to dissect here. I want to bring in our Europe editor, Armin Georgian, who's been listening to all of this. Armin, Let's start off with what Ursula von der Leyen had to say. She had some important things to say about Ukraine, didn't she?
Well, she was really stressing that for the EU, the crisis in the Middle East does not detract from the EU's aid to Ukraine. That was the line that she was pushing in this press conference. And she kind of restated a few facts about EU support, 83 billion euros overall in European assistance to Ukraine since the start of the war. I don't know if that's calculated in terms of member states plus the EU or exactly how that breaks down, but that was the headline figure. She mentioned the 50 billion euros to Ukraine under the Ukraine facility that are being earmarked to Kiev because, according to her, there needs to be reliable and predictable funds for Ukraine going forward. And of course, she mentioned that there had been this video addressed by Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to the summit leaders on the first day, and that his message had been to them to kind of very much stay on the Ukraine file, despite the crises elsewhere, and not just the Middle East, actually, has to be said, but Serbia and Kosovo, for example, too. Ursula von der Leyen then continuing to mention the November progress report that the European Commission would release about Ukraine's path towards the European Union. So that will actually be quite an important date for the EU and for Ukraine, as to decide when Ukraine and Brussels might actually formally open accession negotiations. And one other very quick point I want to mention, she also raised the question of frozen assets, 200 billion euros worth of assets. And as I understand it, the plan is not to expropriate Russian assets, because as we've heard from many international lawyers, that's probably actually illegal, but rather use the windfall on the profits, pool those profits pool the profits and use them to reconstruct Ukraine. So that was the main points that she had to say on Ukraine.
I quickly just want to take you back to Emmanuel Macron, because we didn't have a chance to debrief after his comments. It seems to me there were a couple of things to come out of that. He was stressing the importance there of humanitarian pauses in this conflict in the Middle East, also the creation of a humanitarian coalition. What stood out to you as the takeaways there with Macron's comments?
Well, a couple of things stood out for me, Monty. It was interesting that he kept using the word ceasefire. At least that's what I couldn't actually hear the original French because I had the translation in my ear, but certainly it was the interpreter used the word ceasefire, which is going well beyond what the summit agreed language uses. They talk about humanitarian pauses, not ceasefire. The word ceasefire is mentioned nowhere in the summit conclusions. So Macron, I think, is clearly one of those EU member states that wanted an actual ceasefire to be mentioned. He didn't get that in the final summit conclusions, but he said a humanitarian ceasefire is what we need. And he was a little bit more specific than the summit conclusions about how those measures could actually come about. That's to say, the humanitarian corridors. He talked about a possible land bridge into Gaza and also efforts from the sea to provide humanitarian aid. And he said that the French authorities were in touch with their Israeli counterparts on those issues. So it's still a little bit vague, but not as vague as the summit conclusions themselves. Just one final point that struck me, Monty. You know that there was a lot of talk before this EU summit whether Macron would be able to make headway with his idea of an international coalition against Hamas. This was an idea that he floated when he visited Israel, and it was likened to his idea for an international coalition against the Islamic State organization. Well, I think we can say, looking from the EU summit conclusions, that they did not, his other EU colleagues did not follow him on that idea. There is no mention anywhere in the summit conclusions about an international coalition against Hamas. So this is something that he kept. He didn't apparently make a lot of headway on that question. He mentioned Daesh, the French name for Islamic State group, only once, sort of a throwaway line in passing during his own press conference, but there was certainly no mention of any kind of international coalition against Hamas in the summit conclusions themselves.
Okay, our Europe editor, Armin Georgian, reporting for us from Brussels. Armin, thanks for helping us dissect all of that.